The house smelled of lemon polish and decay, a sterile combination that had become the soundtrack to my life. For 3 months, our living room had been transformed into a hospice ward, the comfortable sofa and family photos pushed against the walls to make room for the hospital bed. In that bed lay Arthur, my father-in-law, a man who had once been a giant of laughter and booming opinions, now reduced to a fragile whisper of himself. The cancer had been relentless, eating away at him piece by piece, until all that was left was a flicker in his pale blue eyes. My days had fallen into a rhythm of medication schedules, sponge baths, and quiet, one-sided conversations. I'd read to him from old newspapers, tell him about the birds in the garden, and hold his cool, papery hand, pretending he was still the man who walked me down the aisle when my own father couldn't. My husband, Mark, called him a saint. "You're a saint, Sarah," he'd say, kissing my forehead before heading off to work. His eyes, once bright with love, now held a permanent exhaustion. The strain of watching his father fade was immense, and I told myself his growing distance was just a symptom of his grief. He was a good man, a devoted son. He just didn't have the stomach for the daily, intimate work of dying. That task, it seemed, had fallen to me. My sister, Chloe, was a constant presence, a whirlwind of manufactured cheerfulness. She'd arrive with soups I knew Arthur couldn't eat and bouquets of flowers that made him sneeze. "You're doing so much, sis," she'd sigh, her perfectly manicured hand resting on my shoulder. "I don't know how you manage. Mark and I were just saying, you're the strongest person we know." She and Mark had grown closer through this, a united front of support for me, the weary caregiver. They'd often come over together, finishing each other's sentences as they recounted their day, a small comfort in the suffocating stillness of the house. I was grateful for them, for their solidarity. I was a fool. This evening was quieter than most. A storm was rolling in, the sky turning a bruised purple. Mark was working late, and Chloe had dropped off a lasagna earlier, giving my arm a squeeze that felt more like a claim than a comfort. Arthur had been restless all day, his breathing shallow, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. I sat beside him, gently dabbing his forehead with a cool cloth. His eyes found mine, and for the first time in weeks, there was a spark of clarity, of pure, undiluted urgency. His fingers, surprisingly strong, wrapped around my wrist. "Sarah," he rasped, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. It was the first time he'd said my name in a month. My heart leaped. "I'm here, Arthur. I'm right here." He tried to pull himself up, his body trembling with the effort. He's not." The words caught in his throat, and a fit of coughing seized him, a terrible rattling sound that shook his entire frame. I helped him settle back against the pillows, offering him a small sip of water. His grip on my wrist didn't loosen. His eyes, wide with a terror I didn't understand, were locked on mine. "Be careful," he whispered, the words barely audible over the rising wind outside. "She's not what you think." "She? Who, Arthur?" I leaned closer, my ear inches from his lips, desperate to understand. Was he delirious? Was he talking about one of the nurses? He shook his head, a tiny, frustrated movement. His lips formed another word, but only a faint sigh escaped. His grip slackened, and his eyes fluttered closed. The clarity was gone, replaced by the familiar, vacant stillness. I sat there for a long time, the echo of his words hanging in the air like a ghost. "Be careful. She's not what you think." A cold knot of dread began to form in the pit of my stomach. He wasn't delirious. He was trying to warn me. Our love story had been simple, almost cliché. Mark and I met in college, a classic case of the serious architecture student falling for the free-spirited literature major. He was structured and calm. I was chaos and poetry. We balanced each other. Our first 5 years of marriage were a blur of weekend trips to the Oregon coast, late-night talks over cheap wine, and the slow, steady work of building a life. We were a team. When my mother passed away 3 years ago, he was my rock, holding me together when I felt like I was shattering into a million pieces. It was during that time that Chloe, my younger sister, became a more permanent fixture in our lives. With our mother gone, she clung to me, her grief a raw and needy thing. She started dropping by unannounced, her car a familiar sight in our driveway. Mark, ever the caretaker, welcomed her with open arms. "She needs us right now," he'd say, and I agreed. We were all she had left. Slowly, our duo became a trio. Chloe would join us for movie nights, help Mark in the garden, and bring over dinner on weeknights. I just don't want you two to have to worry about a thing," she'd say, her smile wide and bright. Looking back, I can see the shift. It was subtle, like the turning of a season. The jokes between Mark and Chloe became inside jokes, their conversations filled with references I didn't understand. They developed a shorthand, a way of communicating with just a look. I told myself it was natural. They were bonding in their shared concern for me, the grieving daughter, the fragile wife. When Mark's firm landed a huge project downtown, his work hours became unpredictable. He'd come home late, smelling of takeout and exhaustion. Chloe often stayed late with me, keeping me company. "He's working so hard for you, for us," she'd say, topping off my wine. "He just wants to give you the world, Sarah." When Arthur was diagnosed, the dynamic solidified. I quit my part-time job at the bookstore to become his full-time caregiver. It was a decision I made without hesitation. Mark was devastated by the news, and I wanted to shoulder the burden. Mark and Chloe became the designated support team. They handled groceries, ran errands, and managed the bills. They'd huddle together at the kitchen table, whispering over bank statements and insurance forms. "Don't you worry your pretty little head about this stuff," Chloe would tell me, patting my hand. "You just focus on Arthur." I see it now, how perfectly they isolated me. I was the angel of the sick room, praised for my sacrifice, while they operated as a separate unit, managing the world outside my bubble of grief and duty. The signs were all there, hiding in plain sight. The time I walked in on them in the kitchen, their heads bent close together, their laughter cutting off the second they saw me. "Just talking about that ridiculous contractor," Mark had said, a little too quickly. Or the way Chloe started wearing the same subtle, woodsy perfume that I'd once bought for Mark, a scent that now seemed to linger in every room of my own house. I had dismissed it all as the byproduct of stress, of shared trauma. I saw them as allies, two people I loved, leaning on each other to support me. The truth was so much more insidious. They weren't leaning on each other. They were holding each other up as they slowly, methodically pushed me down. The first real crack in my carefully constructed reality appeared on a Tuesday, disguised as a piece of junk mail. It was a waterlogged circular from a boutique hotel up in the Cascade Mountains, a place called the Pinecone Lodge. I was about to toss it into the recycling bin with the rest of the day's mail when the logo caught my eye. It was a stylized pine cone, identical to a doodle I'd seen on Mark's notepad a few weeks ago. He'd been on a work conference that weekend, a grueling 3-day affair in Seattle, or so he'd said. Curiosity, sharp and unwelcome, pricked at me. I smoothed out the damp paper. The ad was for a romantic autumn getaway, complete with photos of couples sipping champagne in a hot tub overlooking a misty lake. It was the kind of place you took a lover, not a colleague. I told myself it was nothing, a coincidence. But Arthur's whispered warning echoed in my mind. "Be careful." Later that day, while I was cleaning out Mark's wallet to retrieve a misplaced insurance card for the pharmacy, my fingers brushed against a folded receipt. It was tucked away in a hidden compartment behind his driver's license. My heart began to beat a little faster. With trembling hands, I unfolded it. The receipt was from the Pinecone Lodge. The date was from that same weekend he was supposed to be in Seattle. The charge was for a 2-night stay in the honeymoon suite, including a couple's massage and 2 orders of oysters from room service. I sank onto the edge of our bed, the paper crinkling in my fist. The room felt suddenly cold. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe he'd gone with a work friend. Maybe it was a company expense he'd been reimbursed for. But the charge wasn't on his company card. It was on our personal credit card, the one we shared. The one I rarely checked anymore, because Chloe and Mark had taken over the finances. A wave of nausea, unrelated to Arthur's illness, washed over me. I remembered that weekend vividly, I had been so overwhelmed, struggling with a particularly bad week for Arthur. I had called Mark multiple times, desperate just to hear his voice, but most of his calls went straight to voicemail. He'd texted back hours later, apologizing. "Sorry, babe. Stuck in back-to-back sessions. Signal is terrible here." And Chloe? Where had Chloe been that weekend? She had called me on Friday morning, her voice full of regret. "Oh, Sarah, I'm so sorry, but I have to go out of town. My old college roommate, Jessica, is having a crisis. I have to drive up to Bend to see her. I feel terrible leaving you alone." She'd sounded so convincing, so genuinely conflicted. Bend. Not the Cascade Mountains. But it was in the same direction, a plausible detour. My mind replayed their interactions, the shared glances, the quiet laughter. The pieces were slotting together, forming a picture so monstrous I couldn't bear to look at it directly. But the evidence was there, a crisp, damning receipt in my hand. He hadn't been at a conference, and I had a sickening feeling that Chloe had never been to Bend. They had been together in a honeymoon suite, eating oysters while I was at home, changing Arthur's bedsheets. The betrayal was so profound, so complete, it felt like it was hollowing me out from the inside. Confrontation was never my strong suit. I was a peacemaker, a smoother of rough edges, the one who always chose quiet compromise over loud conflict. But the receipt from the Pinecone Lodge felt like a live grenade in my pocket, and the silence in the house was becoming unbearable. I waited until that evening, after Chloe had dropped off dinner and left, her customary, "You're an angel, Sarah," echoing in the hallway. I found Mark in the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped. For a fleeting moment, I almost lost my nerve. He was grieving, I told myself. I was adding to his burden. But then I remembered the oysters and the honeymoon suite, and the anger returned, cold and sharp. I laid the receipt on the counter next to his glass. I didn't say a word, just watched him. He glanced down, his expression unreadable at first. Then he picked it up, his brow furrowing as he read it. He looked up at me, and his face was a mask of weary confusion. "What's this?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "It was in your wallet," I said, my own voice shaking slightly. "The weekend of your conference in Seattle. This is from a hotel in the Cascades." He let out a long sigh, running a hand through his hair. He looked at me, and his eyes were full of something I mistook for pain, but now I recognize as performance. "Oh, that," he said, his tone dismissive. "A few of us decided to stay there instead of the conference hotel downtown. It was cheaper, quieter. We carpooled up after the sessions." The lie was so smooth, so practiced, it almost sounded plausible. But the details didn't add up. The honeymoon suite, Mark? A couple's massage? He actually chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "The front desk must have messed up the booking. We just needed rooms, Sarah." "We didn't care what they were called." He took a sip of his whiskey, not meeting my eyes. "Honestly, I'm a little hurt you'd go snooping through my wallet. Don't I have enough to deal with right now? My father is dying in the next room, and you're interrogating me about a hotel receipt?" The gaslighting was immediate and effective. Suddenly, I was the villain. I was the suspicious wife, the one adding stress to an already impossible situation. Tears pricked at my eyes, tears of frustration and shame. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was overwrought, my mind twisted by grief and exhaustion. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my anger deflating like a punctured balloon. I'm not myself lately." "I know, babe," he said, his voice softening. He came around the counter and wrapped his arms around me. His hug felt wrong, a hollow imitation of the comfort it once offered. "We're both under a lot of pressure. Let's not fight. We need to be a team right now." The next day, Chloe called. Her voice was laced with that syrupy concern she did so well. "Hey, sis, Mark told me you two had a little tiff last night. He's just so stressed about his dad. We all are. You have to be patient with him." Her words were like salt in a wound. She was backing him up, reinforcing the narrative that I was the unstable one. She knew. Of course she knew. She had probably helped him craft the lie. They were a team, all right. and I was the one they were playing against. I stood in the quiet hallway after the call, Arthur's warning ringing in my ears. I had let them convince me I was crazy, but I wasn't. My instincts were screaming, and for the first time in my life, I decided I was going to listen. The storm that had been threatening for days finally broke on Thursday night, lashing the windows with rain and rattling the old house to its bones. Inside, a different kind of storm was gathering. Arthur had been fading all day. The hospice nurse, a kind woman named Maria, had visited in the afternoon. Her expression was gentle but grave. "It won't be long now," she'd said, squeezing my hand. "Make sure you say what you need to say." Mark was on his way home from work, and Chloe was supposedly picking up prescriptions. For a few precious, terrifying moments, it was just me and Arthur. The room was lit only by a small lamp in the corner, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. The rhythmic beep of the oxygen machine was the only sound, a fragile metronome counting down the final seconds of a life. I sat by his bed, holding his hand, its skin as thin and translucent as parchment. His breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. I leaned in close, resting my cheek against his. "It's okay, Arthur," I murmured, tears blurring my vision. "You can rest now. We'll be okay." I wasn't sure if it was a lie or a prayer. Suddenly, his fingers tightened around mine, with a strength that startled me. His eyes, which had been closed for hours, flickered open. They were clear again, that same shocking, urgent clarity I had seen days before. He looked directly at me, past me, through me, as if he could see the entire ugly truth I was still blind to. "Sarah," he breathed, the name a wisp of air. "I'm here," I choked out, my heart pounding against my ribs. "I'm here." He tried to speak again, his mouth forming words that made no sound. His frustration was a palpable thing in the room. He tugged at my hand, pulling me closer until his lips were right beside my ear. The words came out in a broken, desperate rush, a torrent of final confessions powered by his last surge of adrenaline. "The lake house!" he gasped, his breath hot and labored. "My key? In the book. He told me. They sold it." My mind scrambled to make sense of his words. The lake house? Arthur had a small, rustic cabin on Lost Lake that had been in his family for generations. Mark had always said it was dilapidated, practically falling down, and that they had sold it years ago to pay off some of his early business debts. "Mark! And Chloe!" Arthur's voice was fading, each word an immense effort. "I went there, last fall, to see it one last time before the new owners, but it wasn't sold." A cold dread, slick and oily, seeped into my bones. I could hear the front door opening downstairs. Mark was home. "I saw them," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. "Together, in the window, laughing." "He lied, Sarah. He lied about everything." His eyes, wide and filled with a terrible sorrow for me, held mine. He was giving me his last gift, a final, devastating piece of the truth. "The book, my poetry book, on the shelf. Get the key." Then a sound, a soft sigh, like a candle being gently blown out. The tension left his body. His hand went limp in mine. The beeping of the machine beside the bed flatlined into a single, unending tone. He was gone. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The weight of his final words pressed down on me, suffocating me. I saw them, together. The sound of footsteps on the stairs broke the spell. Mark appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of concern. "Sarah? Is everything—" He saw the flat line on the monitor, my face, and he knew. His own face crumpled, but the grief that followed felt hollow, rehearsed. As he rushed to the bed, as Chloe arrived moments later, with her perfect theatrical sobs, I felt nothing but a chilling, terrifying calm. Arthur hadn't just died. He had set me free. The hours following Arthur's death were a surreal ballet of practiced grief. The funeral director arrived, his voice a low, respectful murmur. Mark was the picture of a devastated son, his arm wrapped tightly around Chloe, who played the part of the supportive sister-in-law to perfection. her sobs artfully muffled against his shoulder. They moved as one, a single grieving unit. I stood apart, a ghost in my own home, the silence in my head roaring louder than their performative sorrow. Arthur's final words had rewired my reality. Every touch, every word of comfort from them now felt like a lie. I moved through the motions on autopilot. I made phone calls, answered questions, and nodded when people told me how strong I was. Inside, I was a coiled spring of adrenaline and ice. I needed proof. The word of a dying man, as powerful as it was to me, could be dismissed as delirium. I needed something tangible, something they couldn't deny or twist. The book, my poetry book. Get the key. Deny or twist. While Mark and Chloe were in the kitchen, their heads bent together as they spoke in low tones to arriving family members, I slipped back into the living room. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the metallic tang of finality. I scanned the built-in bookshelf, my eyes landing on a familiar, worn, leather-bound volume, Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. It had been Arthur's favorite. His name was embossed in faded gold on the cover. My hand trembled as I pulled it from the shelf. I fumbled with the pages, my heart hammering against my ribs. Tucked between two pages in the middle of Song of Myself, I found it. A small, old-fashioned brass key, attached to a simple leather fob. I curled my fingers around it, the metal cool against my skin. This was it. The key to the lake house. The key to the truth. I slipped it into my pocket, my mind racing. I needed to get there. Now, before they realized what I was doing. Before they could hide the evidence. I need some air, I announced, my voice surprisingly steady as I walked into the kitchen. Mark and Chloe looked up, their faces a perfect blend of concern and pity. Of course, honey, Mark said, his voice thick with false sympathy. Do you want one of us to come with you? No, I said, a little too sharply. I softened my tone. No, I need to be alone for a minute. Chloe rushed forward, trying to wrap me in a hug. We're right here if you need anything, sis. Anything at all. I stepped back, avoiding her touch. The scent of her perfume, the same one I now associated with Mark, made my stomach turn. I'll be back soon, I lied. I grabbed my car keys and walked out the front door, not looking back. The rain had stopped, leaving the air washed clean and cold. The 40-minute drive to Lost Lake felt like an eternity. The winding country roads were dark and slick, my headlights cutting through the inky blackness. With every mile, the sick knot of dread in my stomach tightened. What would I find? What if I was wrong? What if Arthur had been confused, and I was about to break into an empty, dilapidated cabin for no reason? But a deeper part of me, the part that had been awakened by Arthur's last breath, knew I wasn't wrong. Mark hadn't just lied about a hotel. He had lied about everything. As I turned onto the gravel road leading to the lake, my headlights swept across a small hand-painted sign nailed to a tree. It was supposed to be a private drive, but the sign didn't say sold. It said, the Carter Cabin. He hadn't sold it. It was still theirs. It was still their secret. The lake house wasn't the crumbling ruin Mark had described. It was a perfectly maintained log cabin, nestled amongst towering pines, with warm light glowing from the windows. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney. Someone was here, or had been, very recently. My breath caught in my throat. The brass key felt heavy and cold in my trembling hand. For a moment, I considered turning back, driving away and pretending I had never come. But I couldn't. I had to know. I parked my car down the road, hidden by a thicket of trees, and approached the cabin on foot. The key slid into the lock with a well-oiled click. There was no resistance, no groan of rusted metal. This door was used often. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air didn't smell of dust and neglect. It smelled of fresh pine, beeswax, and a faint, familiar perfume. Chloe's perfume. The main room was cozy and immaculate. A fire crackled in the hearth, its flames casting a warm glow over a plush sofa, 2 wine glasses left on the coffee table, and a thick, hand-knit blanket draped over an armchair. This wasn't a forgotten relic. It was a home. It was their home. I walked through the small space in a daze, my hand trailing over the polished wood surfaces. On the mantelpiece, above the fire, was a row of framed photographs. My stomach clenched. They weren't photos of Arthur or his parents. They were photos of Mark and Chloe, laughing on a boat, their arms wrapped around each other, kissing under a brilliant autumn tree, its leaves the color of fire. One photo stopped me cold. It was them, standing on the cabin's porch, Mark holding a bottle of champagne, Chloe holding up her hand to display a delicate diamond ring on her left finger. A ring I had never seen before. They looked like a couple celebrating an engagement. My knees felt weak. I stumbled into the small bedroom. The bed was unmade, the sheets rumpled. On the nightstand sat a half-empty bottle of water and a book, one of Chloe's favorite romance novels. I opened the closet door, and my last sliver of denial evaporated. Her clothes hung neatly beside his. Silk blouses, summer dresses, and a familiar cashmere sweater I had once complimented her on. His flannel shirts, worn jeans, and hiking boots. They hadn't just been visiting. They were living a life here, a whole secret life, parallel to the one I thought we were all sharing. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I backed out of the room, my eyes scanning for something, anything else that could make this nightmare real. On the small kitchen counter, tucked beneath a stack of mail addressed to Mark at this address, I found a leather-bound journal. Chloe's journal. My hands shook so violently I could barely open it. The pages were filled with her looping, elegant script. I flipped to the most recent entry, dated just last week. Mark is worried about Sarah. She's getting suspicious. I told him to just hold on a little longer. Once his father is gone, everything will be easier. He can finally leave her. He promised me. He said we can finally stop hiding. It's been 3 years of this, 3 years of waiting in the wings, but he's mine. He's always been mine. She was just the detour. She was just the detour. The words burned into my brain. 3 years. The affair hadn't started with Arthur's illness. It had been going on since my own mother died. They had used our shared grief as a cover, a foundation on which to build their tower of lies. I closed the journal, my fingers numb. The loving sister, the devoted husband. They were characters in a play they had written together, and I was the unsuspecting audience, the fool. I stood in the center of their secret world, surrounded by the evidence of their betrayal, and felt the last of my old life burn away, leaving nothing but the cold, hard ash of truth. I don't remember the drive back. My mind was a maelstrom of images from the lake house, the photographs, the clothes, Chloe's handwriting branding the words she was just the detour onto my soul. When I walked back into my own house, it felt like a foreign country. The scent of lilies from the funeral arrangements was suffocating. Mark and Chloe were in the living room, sitting on the sofa, their heads close together. They were looking through an old photo album of Arthur's, a perfect portrait of mourning. They looked up as I entered, their expressions shifting to practiced concern. "Sarah, you were gone so long. We were worried," Mark said, starting to stand. I didn't give him the chance. I walked to the coffee table and dropped the key, the brass key from the lake house. It landed with a heavy, definitive clink that shattered the quiet. They both stared at it, their faces instantly draining of color. Chloe's hand flew to her mouth. Mark froze, half risen from the couch. "Arthur was a good man," I said, my voice unnervingly calm, devoid of the tears and hysterics they were likely expecting. "He was a terrible liar, though. He told me he sold the lake house years ago. But you two, you're professionals." Mark sank back onto the couch, his face ashen. "Sarah, I can explain—" "Can you?" I cut him off, my voice gaining strength. "Can you explain the last 3 years? Can you explain the honeymoon suite while I was home caring for your dying father? Or should I just ask Chloe? I read your journal, by the way," I said, my eyes locking onto my sister's. Her face, which had been a mask of shock, crumbled into pure, unfiltered panic. It was very illuminating, especially the part where I was just a detour. "Was that before or after you started wearing my husband's favorite perfume?" Chloe burst into tears, the crocodile tears of someone who has been caught. "I didn't mean for it to happen. We fell in love." You fell in love while my mother was dying? I shot back, the ice in my voice finally cracking to reveal the rage beneath. You used my grief, our family's tragedy, as your playground. You stood in my kitchen and told me I was a saint while you were sleeping with my husband. I turned to Mark, who sat staring at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. And you let me quit my job, give up my life, and devote every waking moment to your father, all while you were building a second life with her. You watched me, day after day, and you said nothing. I was going to tell you, he mumbled, the words pathetic and hollow. After Dad passed, I didn't want to hurt you. A harsh, bitter laugh escaped my lips. Hurt me? Mark, you didn't just hurt me. You erased me. You and your perfect partner in crime here. I looked from his face to my sister's, seeing them for what they truly were. Weak, selfish, and cruel. Arthur knew. In his last moments, he wasn't thinking of himself. He was thinking of me. He was trying to protect me from you. That's more than either of you has ever done. I didn't wait for another excuse, another lie. I walked to the hallway, grabbed my purse and my car keys. I didn't need to pack a bag. There was nothing in this house of lies that I wanted to take with me. The lawyers will be in touch, I said from the doorway. About the house. About everything. Mark finally looked up, his eyes pleading. Sarah, please don't do this. It's already done, I replied. You did this. I walked out the front door and didn't look back. The night air was cold and clean, and for the first time in a long, long time, I could breathe. The grief for Arthur was still there, a sharp ache in my chest, but it was tangled with a strange, fierce sense of liberation. He hadn't just given me a key to a cabin. He had given me the key to my own life,